Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, or what we're calling our Lunch and Learn, on how to build a business case. My name is Ross Beard. I'm with Shadowsoft, and really excited to host you all today because this topic we'll be talking about is very, very important, particularly given the current economic climate. We're being asked to do more with less. And this can lead to burnout, short-term thinking, and sometimes a failure to deliver. So today we're going to learn a new approach to building a business case, which will involve rethinking how we might go about getting the resources we need. So I do want to go through a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our instructor, Kurt. If you've got your Build a Business Case framework document, pull it out or pull it up on your screen. We're going to be working through this today. And if you don't have access to this right now, I have included a link in the chat down towards the bottom right. You can open up the chat and there's a link to the framework. So recommend you download that and follow along as Kurt goes through the presentation. We do want to make this as engaging and as interactive as possible. So encourage questions. Feel free to interject. Use the Q&A panel. We're not going to do the typical thing where we wait till the last minute and answer all your questions. If you add your question in there, we're going to try to address it, along during the session here. And lastly, we are recording this so that we can share this with you after the fact. Right. And then so folks that couldn't make it live can catch it on demand. So now on to introducing my friend and colleague Kurt Bomberger. Kurt has written 3 books on innovation based on 30 years of experience launching everything from Advil to Powerade to iPhone apps to Tesla. He started his career on Madison Avenue, spent a decade at the Coca-Cola Company before becoming a serial entrepreneur, building B2B and B2C software solutions. He earned his MBA at Duke, hence the little jab earlier. And he is also an instructor at Duke University, where he teaches design thinking at their Innovation and Entrepreneurship Institute. Kurt is now Executive Vice President at Shadowsoft, responsible for strategy and innovation. And he's really here to help customers be more successful. Right. And that's why we're here today for this webinar or lunch and work session. So really encourage y'all to lean in. We're going to be teaching you how to be more successful in pitching your ideas and ultimately getting the resources that you need and deserve. Kurt's full of stories, so if we have time at the end, we may hear some stories when he was pitching Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, but we will see how things go, throughout the hour. So on that note, I will pass the stage over to you, Kurt.
Well, thanks, Ross. And thanks everybody for being here. We are going to make this kind of a working session. And so it's really important that any questions that you have, we address them right away. I've been on hundreds of webinars in the past, and the last thing you want to do is hear someone prattle on and not be able to ask any questions that are relevant to you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on how to build your business case using a proven framework. And so the reason that we're using the proven framework and why it's so powerful is that it can work with any audience. It's reusable for any use case, and it's very simple to understand. So we're going to go through it step by step, and we're going to help you think about a new way to pitch your business case, which is different than what you've done in the past. In the past, most people have come up with a pitch that is usually a PowerPoint pitch. And as Ross gets this loaded up, it usually looks something like this. it is, you got a title slide and you've got logos and you've got all kinds of different elements. But the real key is that you've got so many slides that you'll never get because you've already lost your audience. And so here's the problem in a nutshell. Usually when you're pitching, you're telling as opposed to engaging, or you're explaining rather than persuading. And you try to justify what you're recommending rather than inspiring. And so we're going to flip this, and it's going to be very different than what you've done before. And in flipping this, we're going to be using a case study of Chick-fil-A, and we're going to get into the technical aspects of it. But initially, what we're going to do is just recognize that what you've done in the past is just not going to work again in the future. Okay, so let's start by talking about the masters of all stories, and that's Steve Jobs. Steve really believed that every innovation starts with a story, and he was the master storyteller. Tim Cook has now succeeded him, and Tim does the same thing, and they also pitch the same way because it works. This is the framework that Apple uses. It's also the framework that Google uses, and it's worked for McKinsey. I've seen it work all kinds of places. So what we're sharing with you today is the best of the best in a framework that's going to work because it understands that a great story engages people immediately. And a great story shows how life can improve and shows the way it can progress. And a great story also gives hope for a better tomorrow. And so that's very different than how we pitch our business case today. We tend to be very right-brained and be very analytical about it. What we want to do is we want to be more creative about it. And what we want to do is engage people so that they're inspired and that they want to give you money. Now, the other thing that every great story has is it has this guy, and this thing exists. Write down in the chat if you know what this is. And then if you know what it is, then answer, what do you do with it? And what does it do to you? And what is it trying to do? What is its goal? We'll see if anybody has any answers. Don't be shy now. This is interactive. Well, this is the devil's advocate, okay? And the devil's advocate is there at every pitch. And so what you have to recognize is that that is going to happen. And when you're making your business pitch, that devil's advocate is going to come up and it's going to say something like, thanks for all your hard work, or pushing the envelope, or getting us to think differently. And it's always followed by the next word, which is, but, and that's when they shoot down your idea. Okay. So the framework specifically addresses the devil's advocate in each step along the way. And so as we go through this, we'll be explaining to you what the devil's advocate might be saying or thinking or asking, and then how you can respond to that. So you handle objections up front. The worst thing that you can do is to say, I'll take all the questions at the end, because that's perfect for the devil's advocate. They wait until the end, and then they go in and sabotage everything that you're trying to do. You want to handle the objections in real time, and you want to be able to handle them so that all of the enthusiasm is allowed to bubble up as you go through and present your idea. So those are some of the components. If you have any questions about this anywhere along the line, just put them in the chat or bubble them up and we'll try to address them. What we said was going to be so important to telling a great story is to have a great framework. And so I'm going to break this down for you bit by bit. All right. It starts with defining the problem. And the problem that we usually use, especially as technical people, is we tend to get into the technologies way too early. What we need to do is we need to focus on what is the problem that's affecting people who are trying to make revenue for us. So keep that in mind, and we'll go into it in more detail and give you some specifics. But we don't frame up the problem right, which means we don't actually articulate how it's impacting people in meaningful ways. So think about, the typical situation. What happens is you go in and you've got a solution that you think is the right thing to do, and it usually has a very big price tag around it. Well, you're turning off people right away, because all they're doing is they're immediately looking at, well, how much is this going to cost? And then what am I going to get out of it? Instead of focusing them on the pain that people are suffering. And so this is very different than probably how you've done it, but we'll take you through exactly what Chick-fil-A did and how they were able to get hundreds of millions of dollars invested into their IT solution. And you may not have as big an ask, but seeing what they did is a great way to inform what you need to do. So once you have defined the problem, then it's time for you to talk about your solution. And this has to be a real pithy one-liner. Now, we'll go through this again in detail, but I just want to get that in your mind that it's got to be short and sweet and focus on that. But every solution has to have a certain set of requirements that have to be met. And it's okay to do that. It's okay. And actually, it's encouraged to do this because this is where you'll defeat the devil's advocate more times than not, is to say, here's what our requirements are. And then here's how we went out and validated that it's going to work. So a lot of the devil's advocate's objections are going to come during this middle part of your story. And during that middle part of your story, that's when you want these things to bubble up and not push them to the end. Because ultimately, you're going to end your story talking about success and what this means and how it's transforming people's lives. So that's the general story arc. And it's called a story arc because it starts you off at a lower point and then stair steps you up and delivers you at a higher point. And so that arc is the story arc, from what is today to what could be tomorrow.
So, question for you, Kurt. I think I've been victim to sort of pitching a solution and then asking for the funds. And I get a lot of questions. I get a lot of people nitpicking my solution and why I need this much money. So you're basically saying I need to be focusing more on the problem and getting my audience really thinking and getting bought into the problem.
Absolutely, because if you don't get them bought into the problem, then they're never going to support the solution. And so the first two slides that you do are the most important slides that you'll produce. You should spend a lot of time and effort on them. It does a couple different things. One is it psychologically hooks them in. And the second thing is it establishes your credibility as the person who knows how to solve the problem. And so those two points, what's the problem and what's the impact, are absolutely critical. But rather than talk about it, it might be helpful if we just go and show you how this was done for Chick-fil-A, because it's a real world practical application. So what you want to do in defining the problem is you want to look at it from a physical perspective, an emotional perspective, and a philosophical perspective. And what I mean by that is the physical perspective is, defining what behaviorally or operationally is happening or failing to happen. And then how does that make people feel? And then you roll into what you believe ought to happen. And this is very important because if you connect people on the philosophical part of it, then it's going to be very hard for them to argue against your solution. So in the Chick-fil-A example, their physical problem was that their restaurants couldn't serve customers fast enough. Now, we work with a freight company, and one of the things that we've discovered is that the forklift operators can't do their job efficiently and fast enough. So it's a common problem. It can apply to a lot of different situations. So what I'd like you to do is, in your framework, write down what is the physical problem that's happening right now for you. What is the problem people are slowed down or unable to do? That's the physical problem. Once you have that defined, then what I'd like you to do is to write down what is the emotional impact that that's having. For Chick-fil-A, it was that the owner operators were feeling stressed and overwhelmed, because when you have all these customers showing up and you can't deliver food on time, it's a very stressful situation. And so philosophically, what the IT team at Chick-fil-A felt was every team member ought to have the technology that they needed to deliver great, hot, tasty food with a personal touch. So philosophically, they positioned their technology as being integral to deliver exactly what the customer needed and what the brand stood for. So when you do that and you start thinking less about, I need X amount of infrastructure or Y amount of Kubernetes or Z amount of storage, and you change it into something that's human and philosophical, that's where you're going to get the buy-in. But it's not enough to just skim the surface there. You need to go on to the next level. And that's where you talk about the impact. And usually what you want to do is you want to have 3 major insights or pains. You can call them insights because you've seen what goes on and what's happening. And this is a big principle out of design thinking that I encourage you to borrow. But it's what is the pain that people are experiencing? This is an actual shot of what's happening inside of a restaurant. And you can see on their faces that they're stressed out and they're not enjoying what they're doing. So specifically for this use case, Chick-fil-A found out that while they could aggregate all their data up across the whole system, what they weren't able to do was to forecast how many waffle fries or chicken sandwiches you can put in whatever the product is that you want, needed to be cooked per minute per day, because all they had was things on an aggregated basis. The second thing was that they didn't have the ability to capture data in real time. So they didn't know when the point of sale system was registering what had to happen back in the kitchen. And the third thing was they didn't have a way to communicate to the 10,000 people who are working in the stores every single day. And so if you dimensionalize the magnitude of the pain, there are 10,000 people who are failing to deliver a customer service with a personal touch because the technology isn't there. Mm-hmm. Well, now all of a sudden, you've got people engaged and they're saying, wow, well, we can't have that. That's the approach that you need to bring into this is we can't allow this to happen. Mm-hmm. And now that you've opened what's called a story loop, it's now time to close that story loop. And that's when you talk about your solution. So a solution is really broken down into 3 parts. What is it that you think is going to fix it? And then how is that going to fix it? And then why is that so important? So we've kind of transitioned from setting up the problem into talking about the solution. So if anybody has any questions, again, please bring them up. But for Chick-fil-A, what they decided that they needed was low latency, internet independent apps. That's what they had to produce. How they were going to make those apps work was they needed to host the apps at the edge to match an individual restaurant's workloads. That gave them the specificity that they needed. And the reason that they needed that was because they needed each individual restaurant to be able to scale their operations every day and every minute of every day. And so that pitches the solution as having a major impact on the store operations.
Yeah, just quickly wanted to sort of comment here, and I think emphasize sort of what I'm hearing is that we're only now talking about the technology now that we're entering the solution, which is that so the solution sort of the middle phase of the story after we've already talked about the problem. So the problem is less technology. Solution is where we bring in the technology.
Absolutely, I think that's a mistake that we often make is we lead with the technology and then there's no place for us to go. And so what we have to do is lead with the problem and then follow with the technology to be the solution to the problem. Now, because we're talking about technology, we also have to dimensionalize that technology. And that's where it's important to talk about, okay, well, what are the core requirements that the technology has to deliver? And this is where you do get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty, but you don't want to get into the weeds. So for Chick-fil-A, in their example, they kept it as high level as they did not want a single point of failure in their architecture. And so they needed to make sure that there was redundancy and high availability, but they didn't go into all of those specifics. They just said, we don't want any single point of failure. The other thing was that they wanted to be able to orchestrate their apps effectively and reliably across the entire network on a consistent basis. And so the solution that they picked for that happened to be Kubernetes, because they realized that orchestration had to happen because of the self-healing properties of Kubernetes, and because of the auto detection that can happen with Kubernetes. You can allow that orchestration to happen all the way across your network. And so that was the second requirement that they came up with. And then the third one was they really needed to make sure that their development teams could move faster and more autonomously and not have to rely on ops for namespaces and CPU and RAM and all those sorts of things. They wanted their development teams to be able to move as fast as the ideas came in. And so they established these other requirements, and those requirements were something that were important to articulate, because once they're out there, that's how you can evaluate a solution against those requirements. And so as you look at the myriad of different solutions that you might have and what form and flavor of Kubernetes you would use, you now have the requirements to evaluate that against. And so that's really important to establish. It also gives you a lot of credibility because you've shown that you have defined what the requirements are and how you can check off to make sure that everything is being met. Ultimately, those requirements do have to be validated. And so when you're looking at what capabilities you need to build, those are things that go back to the requirements. And so you need to explain to your audience that what we're going to go out and validate is the orchestration to effectively manage the workload deployments can happen the way we've set up as the requirements. The other thing is that for Chick-fil-A, they wanted their API endpoints to abstract the developers away from the cluster, but to allow and then to enable the retrieval of logs and what's happening in real time so they could see what the status of demand was. And then lastly, they needed metrics and dashboards to proactively monitor the health and the nodes and the core service workloads that were happening. And so those things all have to be validated. So when you're going in and you're pitching a big idea, remember that devil's advocate is going to be there, and they're going to want to get into the details. And this is where you have to show that you've thought things through and you've kind of gone through all of the different iterations of thinking. If there's a new thought that comes from the group, then that's great. But what you want to do is say, well, that's an interesting idea. We'll go validate that. it gives you the kind of the psychic credibility to go on and say, yes, that's great. Thank you for your idea. We'll go out and validate that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you're drawing them in. You're drawing somebody who could have objected in and say, great idea. We'll validate that. And so you're drawing them into the solution rather than letting them become a problem.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just picturing, locking up the devil's advocate in a box, in the meeting room, just keep him or her at bay. This is great, Kurt. I want to just pause for a second and, see if we've got any questions from the group here. We've gone through the beginning. Sounds like we're getting to the end of the middle.
Yes.
Of the story. Any comments from the group here? I'm curious, is this different to what you've typically, the approach you've typically taken when building a case? We got one. We got one. We got one spark from Jay. Thanks for the engagement there. Any others here?
I think that if you're going along with this and you're filling it out and filling out the framework, you will probably discover that the problem is difficult for you to articulate right now. Because if you've thought about it purely as a technology solution, thinking about how many people are impacted by this is probably something that you haven't done.
Right.
And so it's going to take a little work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you got to think about, okay, again, using the logistics group, how many distribution centers do we have? You may not even know the answer to that. But if you figure that out and find that out, and then you find out how many forklift drivers do we have, and how many pallets do they move a day,
mm-hmm.
then you can start to look at the size and magnitude of the pain. And that's what's really important, is to talk about the size and magnitude of the pain. That's where people get engaged. I always use the example of, everybody needs to lose some amount of weight. And we all know that. But nobody actually does anything about it until there's pain, until you become diagnosed as being pre-diabetic, or you've got high blood pressure, or you've got a heart issue that has to happen. Well, now all of a sudden you're going to go do something about it. And that's because the pain became great enough, and how you have to go address it.
Yeah.
Change is difficult for most organizations, because most organizations like a predictable, consistent kind of process. And so what you guys are talking about doing is to make innovation happen and to transform things into a new day. Well, that's going to meet a lot of resistance. Mm-hmm. And so unless you can articulate the pain and the impact that it's going to have, you're going to be dead in the water. And so rather than thinking about it as a technical kind of solution to solve a problem, you have to think about it more holistically about the impact on the business. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to wrap up the importance of those first two things in your framework. And as you're going along and thinking about it, you may have gotten stuck right away and say, oh, I don't know how to do this. Mm-hmm. That's okay. First of all, it's okay because it's a brand new thing. But secondly, it's okay because you may not have all the information that you need, but it's something that you can ask people who are on the front lines about, and then get the answers pretty quickly.
Yeah. So we do have.
Kurt, I assume you're responding to my question. I had some tech issues around including the change, the compelling change or information, right? So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the most important thing, is to establish that for two reasons. One is that it gets everybody engaged and you don't lose them with the ADD that most people have in meetings. But the second thing is that it gets them psychologically connected and involved. And so now they have a vested interest in solving the problem. And because you philosophically have set up that this is what we think we believe, for them not to support you means that they don't philosophically believe that they should provide technology to the 10,000 people working in the restaurants. Oh, you don't think we should do that? Help me understand why you wouldn't want to do that. It makes it very difficult for them to get there. So
and positioning them to kind of formulate that for themselves, right, is what drives the said initiative forward, right? It's different if the technology team, for example, says, hey, we need to do this. Well, they need the why, and they also need to kind of take ownership of why they would need to do that. Does that make sense? To get buy-in, right?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that we do at Shadowsoft a lot is we do workshops that are a day and a half. And I always say that the benefit of the workshop is 50% technology. So you get people aligned on the technology, and 50% of it is organizational behavior. So it really is those two things that combined give you a lot of power moving forward. But you have to get those people aligned and be part of something bigger than themselves. And then ultimately, once you have established, what needs to be validated, then you can focus on how are you going to make sure that you've defined success. And so,
just jumping in, we got one more question.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We did promise to address the questions on the go. Anitha, is this framework applicable for technology-related budget ask, or can leverage for business-related funding?
Absolutely can be used for technology asks. I think what's really important is, as you think about those technology asks, you think about what is the business impact that technology is going to have. And that's the way you need to be thinking about the budget. And if you're talking about the overall budget and why this is important, you might need to go through line item by line item why these these investments are critical to the overall business outcomes. It's what I've found in my 30 years of experience, which means I'm very old. But what I've found is there's always money. There's always money. It's just somebody else has it. And so you have to make a case that's compelling enough to get it from one department into your department. And so there may be an initiative to cut costs 5% across the organization. And that's real. And I don't mean to diminish that. But on the other hand, that 5% cut might be 20% in one area and plus 15% in your area if you've made a compelling business case that you're going to change the outcome of what the business is today to what it could be tomorrow. And technology is that silver bullet. We don't, we know it intuitively because we do it and we deal with it every day, but we don't often make the case to people who have the money that we need to get in order to make all of this success happen.
Kurt, one thing I would like to add on that, when the organization is aligned from the top down, from a goals and objectives perspective, where the CEO, for example, has his or her, goals and objectives clearly defined, and then cascade down through the organization all the way to technology, which supports the business. It's very clear. It becomes very clear when budget requests and such are requested. You can clearly tie that to the overall business objectives at the highest level. Now that's easier said than done, but when that happens, it's very efficient to be able to request and support and defend the initiatives you're requesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. And Chick-fil-A is a great example because, what they said helps define success is to eat more chicken, right? So there's a very clear vision from the top all the way down that their goal is to eat more chicken, but they dimensionalized how they're going to deliver against that aspiration by being very specific about the metrics. So they said that they were going to increase the number of connected and smart devices to over 100,000. They also said that they were going to increase the number of applications that they would use to expand capacity to 30 applications. And they also said that they were going to successfully roll out their proof of concept and pilot to 3,000 restaurants. And so what's really important in defining your success is to be specific. This is where you want to bring the numbers in, because this is where you really want to say, we're going to do it for 100,000 and we're going to increase the applications to 30 and we're going to do it across 3,000 restaurants. Well, that shows the size and magnitude of the change that you're having the impact on. And so everyone intuitively will know, I've got to make a big investment to go do that. So what you want to do is to say, okay, this is going to take a big investment, but where do we start? Where do we begin? And you leave them with the idea of, well, success starts with having a common vision of how things are going to be transformed. And so you want to end your presentation saying, okay, here's where we are today. We have 10,000 anxiously constrained team members who are struggling to build capacity every single day, every single minute of the day. And where we want to go is we want to turn those 10,000 anxious people into 3 million customer-pleasing opportunities and moments every week. So you give them a view of stress and constraint and give them a view of customer-pleasing moments every day. And so once you've done that transformation, it's no longer really a budget issue. It's the only question about the budget is how much, and what's the plan moving forward. And so this is the last thing that you share with them is, so here's the next steps. I mean, everybody has this in their decks today, but instead of calling them next steps, I'd encourage you to use what Apple does and say, oh, and there's one more thing. Once you've got them all excited about this transformation, you say, oh, so one more thing. Here's the plan. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Only 3 steps, no more under any circumstances. People remember in 3s, they think in 3s, and they can only act in 3s. And so you really need to make it simple, easy to understand, and memorable. So it might be that the first step is to go do a proof of concept, So let's prove this because we have some things that we need to validate to meet our requirements. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to pilot this in 100 stores. And then the third thing is going to be a rollout to 3,000 stores. So give them something in bite-sized chunks that they're able to understand and that you can report back on. We've completed our proof of concept in 90 days. We're piloting over the next 90 to 180 days. We'll be ready to roll out in a year's time. Great. Go forth and conquer. That's what you want to be able to do. There will always be the rational side of, can you do it? Can we afford it? What you want to do is you want to let the emotions kind of bubble up and carry the day. And so that's really what you want to try to do when you end your presentation. So what we've got in your framework is we've got 2 things that you have to do up front for the beginning of the story. You got 3 things that you do in the middle, which is where you show how you're going to make these things happen. And then you have 2 things at the end that is the end of the story that shows how life is going to be so much better. And you've quantified it in a way that you feel comfortable that you can deliver but it's also been inspirational. So you remember, where we started about some of the things that we do that we want to change. Right now, we start by going in and telling and explaining and justifying. And what we want to do is we want to engage and inspire and motivate people. And so this is a framework that works. This is a framework that, again, is very simple. It should only be 7 slides that you have to put together. And with those 7 slides, you'll have taken them from where you want them, from where they are today to where you want them to be tomorrow. And so those 7 slides are all you really need to build. One of the things that I'll point out is at no point have we ever talked about funding. So, I'll ask Ross, have you ever gone to a situation where you're making a business case and you didn't talk about funding?
No, I haven't followed the framework.
So you need to have the numbers there, but what you want to do is after you finish your presentation, you really want to say, so now that we're all in agreement on this, let's talk about the timing and the funding, because you want it to be a dialogue and a conversation. The question's going to come up, so you have to be prepared. And the real thing that you want to do is to get it to a question of how fast do you want it to happen? So if you want it to happen really quickly, well, then that's more money and more people sooner. But if you want to drag it out, then you know that you haven't been really successful in getting everybody on board. So if they're saying, well, let's look at it next quarter, let's look at it next month, then you need to go and resurface that a different way, because everybody's not bought in. But if they're starting to say, how quickly can we get it done and when can we roll it out? Well, then you know that you have sold them in, and you can get down into the brass tacks of talking about budgets and requirements.
Yeah, I like this approach, Kurt. I think, as technologists, we're always thinking, okay, how do we get funding for our Kubernetes project? Or, I want to build out a stable, reliable platform to migrate, all of these applications to Kubernetes because I think it's going to help the business. But, this is a good it's a reminder for us to rethink how we approach these projects and start with the problem. Then we can talk about the solution.
And there's a lot of talk about business outcomes now. We have to focus on the business outcomes. And that's what the last part is. You're talking about the business outcomes and what you'll produce. But you can only get to the business outcomes if you start with the problem up front. And so I think, as technologists, where we're really good is in the middle. In that middle part, we're good, but we're missing the front end and the back end. And that's what this framework will help you do, is to think those things through and get the psychological benefits of drawing more people in and shaking their heads as you're going along, as opposed to their initial reaction, which is, why are we here and what do you want? Which is already negative, and a negative disposition that you have to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. John, I'm going to get to yours in a second. Others, feel free to jot your questions in the chat. I do want to sort of highlight and recognize that this is a new framework, right? And we expect you to struggle the first time applying this and thinking this through. So we are offering up 30 minutes with Kurt so that you can work through these new skills that you've learned today. We don't want to just throw this at you and leave you hanging. So we're here to help. Kurt's here to help. He does have one request.
Yes, my one request is that you try to fill out the framework before we work together. So give it a shot. Your situation and your use case is going to be unique to you, but give it a shot. And then when we get together, we have something to work with. and we can start framing things and doing things differently. We may find out that we need another session after the first session because there may be some information that we don't have and need to collect. But we can help you out with that. What we really want to do is to change the way we ask for funding and people, and to get support so that IT becomes really the enabler of change in our organizations.